Okay, so we're open for questions, comments, whatever you want. We'll do those for a little while, then I think we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and figure out if we have some action plans.
So-
Can we ask a question?
You want to
You can ask questions, sure. I'll let you preempt mine.
No, go-
Oh, you had them?
no, I just had a question and a comment. The comment is that I think it's quite clear that we are unable to predict suicide. However, one of the things is that if you suspect somebody has suicidal tendencies, suicidal intent, ideation, suicidal intent, plans, et cetera, you should ask them about it. So one of the big things that there's a myth that goes around that you're going to put the idea into somebody's head by asking them if they're suicidal. That's not the case. So if you or your colleagues or any of your military or otherwise think that somebody is suicidal, you want to ask them about that. The second thing is that assuming we could, we have these risk factors, and again, they're not predictive, but assuming we have these risk factors, so then what do you do about it? So the question is, I suppose you could commit somebody, but what happens is that then they say they're not suicidal anymore, and then you can't keep them, in which case people who want to kill themselves kill themselves. And so people who are chronically suicidal are a big, big problem. People who don't kill themselves we say, maybe we're making this up, but we say that they're looking for help, or they're coming forward to ask because they really have ambivalence or what have you. But anyway, the question really relates to, assuming we had some ability to predict or have risk factors that are very high, what do we do once we recognize that?
Well, the notion of people who are chronically suicidal is a strange notion to me.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you can't be chronically suicidal,
Right.
that you're
Very intense.
suicidal or you're not suicidal. So people may talk about it. There was an interesting study done in Houston. So one of the difficulties of dealing with suicide is you can't talk to people who kill themselves. So you don't really know the difference between what actually makes people so there's suicidal ideation, there's suicidal attempts, and then suicidal gestures, and who knows what any of those things are. No one has been a teenager who hasn't thought, gee, I'll kill myself, and then my friends and my parents will miss me, and that sort of thing. They'll feel bad. That's like, is that suicidal ideation? So there is this sort of spectrum of things. The study in Houston was a study of people who were clearly serious about killing themselves. I forgot how they categorize them, but they were like nearly killed themselves. They're like people like shot themselves in the head or stabbed themselves in the chest. Those sorts of people. For 28% of them, the decision to commit suicide and the action was less than 5 minutes. For 70% of them, the decision to commit suicide and the action was less than an hour. So the question of, when one is suicidal. So by the way, the point that I want to make is that we should be less concerned about suicide and more concerned about the overall well-being of people. That, that if you do that and you pay attention to people and you treat them kindly and you ask them how they're doing and that stuff, the secondary effect is likely to be less suicide if we can affect it at all. So I'm not saying forget about it. I'm saying, there's sort of this cultural issue about what do you do, because the fact that people don't kill themselves doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory. It's like a really bad marker, it seems to me, of when we should intervene and the sorts of things we should intervene for.
Yeah, the other phenomenon we have is that people who are very, very depressed really can't muster the energy to kill themselves, and oftentimes they have a period where they feel better, and then we think they're getting better, and that's when they kill themselves. Anyway, it's a very complicated issue, but the question is, even if we have a predictor, a risk factor, what do we do about it, I think, is a difficult problem.
But I think it depends on what the risk factor is. So again, to have somebody in a combat situation or somebody who is, in the U.S. say, you seem to be having a really tough time, you should get some help. You should do that even if you're not worried about someone committing suicide. And if you do that, you're more likely to catch those people and then look for these 10 things. By the way, having a psychiatrist did not help Thomas Eagleton become vice president of the United States. For those who remember that he was going to be the vice president under George McGovern, although it didn't much matter, ultimately, but he had to leave the race because it was determined that he had been diagnosed as depressed and had had shock therapy.
Had been institutionalized and had
He had
shock
shock therapy. He hadn't been institutionalized.
Okay.
He had shock therapy. And the
You're
point,
right. You're right about that.
And the point that was made about Eagleton is that he was the only person who was psychiatrically cleared to
Actually
run.
treat it,
Now, we have no idea about the rest of the lunatics who are running or what they're likely to do. He was the only one under regular psychiatric treatment who was stable and treated in doing this. Carrie, do you have a question or a comment?
Go ahead.
Hi. So I actually work in suicide prevention. I work for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center.
Identify yourself.
My name's Carrie Smith. I'm actually a BU SPH alum, and I work for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. Veterans is not my area of expertise, but
all right.
my comment is that Leonard brings up a very good point that overall well-being is a very important issue. The DoD task force identified a comprehensive approach for suicide prevention where you're looking at many different areas where you can intervene. No one intervention is going to prevent suicide. And the Air Force actually developed a very successful model in this where it was shown to be effective in reducing rates of suicide, as well as other factors like interpersonal violence and things like that. So a comprehensive approach is really important.
Hi, so my question didn't directly go to the suicide. It was a thing that came up in my mind, George, when you had one of your slides up in one of the books where the soldier, I can't remember his name, who had been, it wasn't until he was promoted or received recognition within the military institution itself that then he felt sort of like he was confident or was in a place where then he could get whatever help he needed or admit that there was something going on. It seems to me that I heard a partial report on the radio, and it's probably someone in the audience that can respond to this better than the three of you, that there is also a difference between I don't know, I'm not well educated on the ways of the military, but in terms of like medals, Purple Hearts, whatever, recognition that people get when they are injured within combat, and then that's recognized in a very formal sense, that people who have like TBIs do not automatically or routinely get recognized in the same way. And I'd heard like a tail end of something on a news report, but don't know whether it was just, what the basis of that was and if that's so.
Yeah, let's ask Paul or Andy. What's the current status of that issue?
The current status is that Purple Hearts will not be awarded for those who have PTSD, for folks who have Gulf War illness, TBI, unless there was an actual incident at the time and they were treated and they meet a whole series of criteria. The military stance for Purple Hearts has always been that they would rather have lots of deserving folks go unrewarded than ever have one slip through who is undeserving.
But if you have physical injury, that's by
Any
definition.
physical injury is okay, though, is that right? Your bleed, is that?
It's much more specific than that, and so it has to be a physical injury from the enemy, and there are a series of, after, I'm not sure when it was changed to include terrorist attacks, it was before September 11th, it may have been after Lebanon. There's this whole host of possibilities on how it can happen, but you also have had to have, there has to be documentation of medical treatment from the wound at the time, and there are a host of, I don't have it all memorized, but there's a host of criteria.
That's fine, I got it, yeah.
But you would say that having physical injury is more likely to have recognition than people who have.
If someone only has PTSD and has no physical
PTSD is not
injury,
going to do it, right?
they will not be getting the Purple Heart.
No matter how bad it is.
There may be an exception for someone who's been a prisoner of war, but that's
Fair enough,
a
yeah.
separate issue.
Right,
But
it is a separate.
with that exception, no. If someone just has PTSD and no physical injury, no.
Other questions?
I'm Lisa Cheticle from the BUSPH. Just was curious, with the talk about, and it's fascinating, the talk about no clear risk factors for suicide. How do you all feel about this push in some quarters to get pre-deployment mental health screening? In other words, before you're deployed to a war zone, you've got to be seen by psychiatrist, is that going to do any good in keeping people from committing suicide or not?
We have a psychiatrist here.
I'm sure it's
Probably not a suicide issue, but it's a
not the-
mental health issue.
Yeah, but also it's not the risk that's the issue. I mean, if we can determine risk factors, the question is predictability. I mean, I think that, but anyway, it's I'd worry much more about the other psychological, psychiatric problems that people have than the suicide risk in
Well,
terms
like
of
what
being-
would you screen people out for, so they shouldn't go in the military?
I would say- people who have, personality disorders, who are unable to follow in a chain of command and follow. I mean, these are people that are screened out. People that have anger control issues, people who have serious depression, people who have, anxiety. I mean, you can go through a whole litany, but I think those are the big areas that I think that you would want to screen for. But whether they're predictive, I'm not sure. Some you could, but probably not. You'd want to have more records than a single visit with anybody. You'd want to have historical information as well as be able to see how the person functioned in an active context as opposed to just by a single interaction.
There's an interesting problem that psychopathy is one of the things that you would screen people out for. If you had people who really like to injure and hurt and kill other people, then you would screen them out. That would be like a bad thing to give them a gun and send them someplace. So by definition, you want people who aren't like that. You have to change them, right? And you have to sort of change behaviors and change attitudes in order to do that. And again, any sort of professional training changes people's personalities in various ways. You go to law school, you end up arguing all the time. It's like, it just changes, that sort of thing. You go to dental school, the first thing you notice are people's teeth. So that when you're trained to become, a member of the armed forces, it changes you in significant ways, just as those other forms of training do. And one of the things has to do with violence and the use of violence. So George mentioned murder-suicide. And the difference between suicide and homicide is like not clear how much of a difference there is, since suicide is just personal homicide. It's the intentional killing of yourself as opposed to the intentional killing of another. And so we see, so if you look at the Columbine thing, forgetting about Fort Hood for the moment, but you look at Columbine, you take these two kids, they go and they kill all their classmates and they shoot themselves. They're like 17 or 18. And everyone has a task force, and no one has any clue as to why that happened, right? Not a clue. There's all this stuff that we read that they wore black trench coats and they were bullied and all that stuff. It turns out that none of that is true, that they had girlfriends and friends and went to the prom and did that thing and then showed up and killed everybody and shot themselves. They're such rare and odd events that it's very hard to make predictions. But you do know that if people like to kill other people, like sociopaths, you don't want to give them a gun.
You also don't want them in the military because they're unable to be controlled.
Yeah, but I'm saying, so you would screen those people out, but then you have to train people who don't have an instinct for that to be really quite different.
Yeah.
My name's Tom, and I attend the VA up in Bedford. And about a month ago, we had our Suicide Prevention Week, and we manned a table at the place that everyone usually walks through. And it was quite good. There was nothing that really came about with someone coming up saying, I want to hurt myself or anything like that. But we did have a table, and it was very effective for outreach. And I didn't know if you guys knew about what you wanted to do with outreach and stuff, so I just figured I'd suggest that, the table and everything. Thank you.
That's good. I thought Leonard made a good point, actually, that if you're really interested in suicide prevention, it's the veterans population you want to concentrate on first. And a lot of the stories in the newspaper that get a lot of play are vets who are seeking mental health treatment and can't get it right away and kill themselves while they're waiting. And that shouldn't happen. I think we all say that.
Right, and the fact that that population is so highly elevated over the regular civilian population would indicate that there's something special going on with that population as opposed to the military population where it looks very much the same as the civilian population.
Yeah, Paul.
Just first, a factual observation. According to VA, the number one risk factor for suicide, and this came out in the trial where Veterans for Common Sense sued VA when VA was turning away suicidal veterans, was a prior attempt at suicide.
Yeah.
So you may want to consider listing that on future slides, just as a point. Because the success rate, unfortunately, well, the success is the wrong word, the completion rate for people who attempt a second or subsequent time is far higher.
Yeah, it's like 30%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's far higher.
Excellent point. That's good.
The other, if I could just follow up on that quickly, the intent is really as big a concern. I mean, if you have a gun, then obviously that's a problem. But in terms of the intent is really very important. So there are people who take medications, who have take the wrong medication and have less intent and kill themselves or get very sick, as opposed to people who are very suicidal and happen to take a
But
medication.
accidental overdose?
Yes.
It's not suicide.
No, I'm saying people who want to kill themselves, but who, when they take a drug that's not going to kill them, is as worrisome and as concerning
They
as
take the wrong drug, they made a
yeah,
mistake.
exactly. So the intent is the most important aspect of assessing people.
I mean, one of the difficult things to know is what's an attempt. I mean, it's, again, as I said, you have ideation, you have gestures, you have attempts, and you have completed suicides. And what is an attempt? So someone who's tried to stab themselves is much more likely to be a danger in the future than someone who's taken a handful of pills at the moment that their wife or husband was supposed to come home. That those are different kinds of things. So everyone deserves treatment. I'm not disagreeing with what you say, but I'm just saying that we can really overestimate what we think we can do, which is why I think we want to treat people well, even if they didn't try to kill themselves.
Well, that's why there actually is good news. Veterans who do go to VA are less likely
Yeah, you
to
said that,
complete
no.
suicide.
That is
That's what VA reports.
That is true.
And you mentioned a good point on intent. There's intent, and then you also mentioned capability, and that's the presence of firearms and then the firearms training. So it's the combination of intent and capability at the same time. One other factual point just wanted to mention is that service members who, at first enlistment, according to DOD's own numbers, prior to 9/11, were about half as likely to complete suicide compared with civilians who had not enlisted in the military. And that's because the military had screened out people with pre-existing mental health and physical medical conditions. So the fact that the military suicide rate of people on active duty has nearly doubled in about 11 years is a very serious issue for concern. So when you present the fact that the military suicide rate looks to be the same as the civilian suicide rate, you've left out an important historical fact, and that's that the military suicide rate used to be far less than the civilian suicide rate. And then attached to that is also the age component. Service members between about 18 and 24 or 25, I don't have the chart in front of me, were about 3 to 4 times more likely to complete suicide than non-military veterans of the same age group. So if you take, correct, veterans were 3 to 4 times more likely to commit suicide than non-veterans. So if you look at the growth from half the rate all the way up to 3 to 4 times the rate, you have seen between a 6 to 8-fold increase in the suicide rate between a healthy individual screened to enter the Army and then 3-4 years out after coming back from a war. That huge jump, we're talking 600, 800%, is worthy of additional research and study. I would just like, were you aware of those particular facts?
Well, I thought you were talking about, you kept going back and forth between the veterans rate and the military rate. I was talking about the military rate. And
Right.
again, you said that it's doubled. part of the question about those sorts of details, not details, determinations, is how do you determine who committed suicide, and what are the criteria for that determination? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the rate was before 9/11. I also don't know what the rate was when there was a draft. Do you know that, whether that mattered?
Yes, actually it did.
Was it better or worse?
There was actually increases in suicides when civilians learned that they may be drafted because of their lottery number.
Yeah,
Their
I believe
lottery
that.
number was lower. And then there was also an increase in
But they're
suicides.
civilians.
Yeah, there were still
Right.
Civilians were going to be drafted, right? Yeah,
They were about to be drafted.
exactly.
And then service members just in the military, when they got orders to go to Vietnam, there was another increase in suicides. The military knows this. And now what we're seeing is service members who receive notice for a
Redeployment.
second deployment.
Yeah.
The time window between notification of deployment and suicide, there's a peak in there. Because they're being told, this veteran of the war, that they're going to have to go back on active duty and go back to the war and be re-traumatized. So that we're actually seeing a spike in suicide. So what we did at Veterans for Common Sense is after we informed the military of these anecdotal cases, they went and looked at it, and now they stop or have significantly reduced the number of FedEx packages where the military would tell the veteran/guard reservists that they're going back on active duty and going back to the war. Instead, what they do is bring them in and in person tell them that they're going to go back. And they're trying to see if the method of notification of going back to the war may be related to re-triggering trauma and possible suicide.
Seems more likely just that the order itself is what's going to, don't you think?
So there, you make a
By yourself and you're not
Okay, all
undergoing
right, fair
treatment,
enough.
and you get a letter saying that you're going back to the war, and you're by yourself and you have access to weapons, you're a little bit, the risk factors are a little bit different than if you're sitting in
Yeah.
a room with somebody and you're being told
That's
with a bunch
true.
of other people that you have
Oh,
to go back
especially
to
if
the war.
that Texas study Leonard mentioned is true, that it's like an hour between deciding to kill yourself and killing yourself. Yeah, so that would make some sense then. You're right.
So so you make you make a lot of very important and interesting points. So the question then is, should people not be redeployed? If we know that redeployment is a thing, I mean, the question that was asked to Michael, should you give people antidepressants or whatever the drug was and send them back into the war? The answer is no. You don't have to be like a doctor to say that. If you need to be like medicated to do the job, it's probably not a good job for you. Regardless, by the way, it's like, that's what you say about pilots. I'm so nervous, I need antidepressants to fly or whatever. Actually, recently, pilots have been allowed to do that, but not only very recently. So the answer is that if you want the fittest people, then they don't fall into the fittest people. The answer why, so we know that the military, that there are criteria for admitting people, if that's the right word, into the military for recruitment, and that there's a waiver process, and the waiver process has been used to a much greater extent now than recently, and those criteria were supposed to be predictive of the ability to do the job in a safe and effective manner. And so we do those things because we need a military. I mean, the reason why you send people back, I don't think the people who send soldiers back with PTSD are like mean and want to hurt them. It's like they're doing their job, right? They're sending them back to war. And that's why the question.
I think you're right. If they didn't send them back, they
Well,
would be reassigned.
And then what would they do? Who would they send? So the problem is you have a war and you don't have like enough people to fight it. You send less capable people and then they get killed. So do you have a draft to increase the size of the military? But that's the sort of point I was trying to make about the environment, about the environmental issues. So what are the underlying needs? And I don't just mean numbers, but I mean in attitudes. So is the suck it up and take it attitude? For all I know, that's like a really essential part of being in the Army. If you're on a combat mission and you're injured in some way, you're supposed to suck it up. How do you know that you don't suck it up here, but you suck it up there? I think those are like really hard questions of socialization. Where can you socialize people? What can you socialize people for in different circumstances?